My father sent me a text message while I was lying in a hospital bed with blood dripping into my eyes. His new fiancée had just put me there, but his only concern was that I stay away from his new family so I would not ruin their upcoming house purchase. I simply replied, "All right." I did not cry and I did not argue. Instead, I quietly logged into my laptop right there in the emergency room and withdrew my signature as the sole financial guarantor for the pristine $1.5 million mansion they were scheduled to close on. What they did not realize was that without my perfect credit score, their entire world was about to collapse, and they were about to lose absolutely everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and used you for their own gain. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor in Bay 4 of the Chicago Medical Center emergency room was the only thing keeping my pulse steady. The harsh fluorescent lights glared down at me, reflecting off the stainless steel medical trays and highlighting the sterile, suffocating smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol. A frantic trauma team was rushing a crash cart past my curtained alcove, shouting urgent medical codes into the chaotic, overcrowded hallway. Somewhere in the distance, a child was crying and a woman was desperately arguing with a tired triage nurse about insurance papers. But my little corner of the room was eerily quiet. I am Kiara, 30 years old, and I was sitting perfectly still on the stiff hospital bed, gripping the thin cotton blanket. Dr. Evans, a weary-looking resident with dark circles under his eyes, leaned over me with a needle and thread. He was meticulously working on the jagged gash just above my left eyebrow. 7 stitches, he murmured, his eyes focused intently on my broken skin. You are incredibly lucky, Kiara. A fraction of an inch lower and you could have suffered a severe skull fracture or lost your eye entirely. I did not flinch as the needle pulled the heavy black thread through my skin. I felt the tug and the sharp stinging pinch, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, hollow clarity expanding inside my chest. My cold and calm demeanor seemed to deeply unnerve the medical staff around me. The nurses walking past my bay kept giving me pitiful, nervous glances, expecting me to break down at any moment. They were waiting for the tears, the screaming, the hysteria, the normal reaction of a woman who had just survived a violent physical encounter with her own family. But I had run out of tears for these people a very long time ago. Growing up in our neighborhood, I learned early on that crying got you nowhere. My father, Marcus, was a highly prominent figure in our local church community, a man who demanded absolute perfection and total submission from his household. Our home was always filled with smiling guests and lavish Sunday dinners, but behind closed doors it was a fortress of impossible expectations and emotional distance. I was always the family scapegoat, the one who asked too many questions, the one who never quite fit into the neat, obedient little box he designed for me. While my peers were focused on fitting in and seeking validation, I was quietly studying financial markets, hiding business books under my mattress, and building my ultimate escape route. I poured every ounce of my energy into my education and my career. I worked my way up the brutal corporate ladder to become a director of credit risk management, making high-stakes decisions that move millions of dollars daily. I built a life of ultimate luxury, living in a gorgeous downtown penthouse, completely independent of my father and his heavy-handed control. I wear tailored designer suits, I drive a luxury car, and my bank accounts reflect years of relentless hard work. Yet despite all my success, I somehow still found myself tethered to his toxic orbit out of some misguided sense of daughterly duty and a foolish hope that he might one day actually love me. The doctor snipped the final black thread with a pair of small silver scissors and pressed a fresh white gauze pad against my forehead, securing it with medical tape. He sighed heavily and asked if there was anyone I wanted him to call to come pick me up. A husband, a best friend, maybe my parents. The sheer irony of that question almost made me laugh out loud. I looked down at the dark red blood that had soaked completely through the collar of my favorite cream silk blouse, turning the expensive fabric into a stiff, ruined mess. It was a glaring, undeniable physical manifestation of the emotional bleeding I had endured from my family for the past 30 years. I looked the doctor dead in the eye and told him no. There was absolutely no one to call because the people who were supposed to protect and love me were the exact same people who had just sent me to this hospital. I sat there on the crinkly hospital paper, letting the chilling reality wash over me. The chaotic hospital environment swirling outside my thin curtain felt like a distant, blurry dream. All I could focus on was the profound realization that my role as the dependable punching bag was officially over. From this exact moment forward, I was no longer the loyal victim waiting for an apology that would never come. I was the executioner, and I was going to make them pay for every single drop of blood. A young nurse with sympathetic brown eyes stepped into my curtained bay, carrying a warm, damp towel. She gently began wiping the dried blood from the side of my neck, her movements hesitant, as if she expected me to shatter. She asked me quietly if I wanted to press charges against the person who attacked me. I looked at her and calmly told her exactly how I ended up in her emergency room. Just 3 hours earlier, I was sitting in a velvet armchair at an elite bridal boutique in the Gold Coast district. It was an exclusive appointment for my future stepsister, Chloe. My father, Marcus, and his fiancée, Valerie, had dragged me there under the guise of family bonding. But I knew the real reason I was invited. I was the walking checkbook. The boutique was a masterpiece of luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and the scent of expensive vanilla and fresh orchids filled the air. Chloe was standing on a circular velvet pedestal, admiring herself in a custom silk gown that cost more than most people make in a year. Valerie was sipping complimentary champagne from a crystal flute, beaming with immense pride, as if she had personally funded this entire extravagant lifestyle. I sat there quietly checking work emails on my phone, having already agreed to cover the exorbitant cost of the dress as a wedding gift. But for Valerie, my generosity was never quite enough. It was simply a baseline from which she could aggressively demand more. Valerie confidently walked over to my chair and casually dropped a glossy catering brochure directly onto my lap. She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against a premium champagne reception package. She told me with a sickeningly sweet, entitled smile that they had decided to upgrade the wedding bar. She stated it would only be an additional $50,000 and that she had already put my name down as the official sponsor. I did not even look at the brochure. I picked it up, handed it right back to her, and said absolutely not. I calmly reminded her that I was already co-signing the massive mortgage for their new house and paying for a ridiculous wedding gown. I told her my bank account was not a bottomless pit meant to fund a fake lifestyle she could not actually afford. The warm air in the luxury boutique instantly turned freezing cold. The sickly sweet smile completely vanished from Valerie's face, revealing the greedy, desperate woman hiding underneath the designer makeup. She started raising her voice, accusing me of being deeply selfish. She claimed I was trying to ruin her daughter's special day because I was terribly jealous of their perfect happiness. I stood up slowly, picking up my leather handbag, and told her I was leaving. I told her she could pay for the champagne herself or she could serve tap water. That was the exact moment she completely lost her mind. As I turned my back to walk toward the exit, Valerie lunged at me like a wild animal. She shoved me from behind with both of her hands, using all of her body weight to propel me forward. I was wearing 4-inch stilettos, and I had absolutely zero time to brace myself. I flew forward, pitching directly into a heavy tempered glass display table holding delicate crystal bridal tiaras. The sickening crack of my forehead hitting the thick edge of the glass echoed violently through the entire boutique. The heavy table shattered into jagged pieces beneath my weight, sending diamonds and glass flying across the floor. I hit the solid marble floor hard. The sharp ringing in my ears was completely deafening. A thick, warm liquid immediately started pouring down my face, blinding my left eye. I lay there on the cold marble, stunned and severely disoriented, tasting bitter copper in my mouth. I reached up and felt the deep open gash on my forehead. My hands were instantly covered in my own dark red blood. But the intense physical pain of the impact was absolutely nothing compared to the emotional horror of what happened next. I looked up through my blurred, bloody vision, desperately searching for my father. I expected him to grab Valerie and pull her away. I expected him to drop to his knees and press his hands to my bleeding head to stop the flow. I expected a father protecting his child. Instead, I saw Marcus sprinting frantically across the room directly toward Chloe. He was ripping off his expensive suit jacket and violently throwing it over her pristine white gown, desperate to protect the fabric from the drops of my blood that had splattered across the marble floor. He did not look at me. He did not ask if I was conscious or if my neck was broken. He was entirely focused on making sure his new stepdaughter's wedding dress remained perfectly clean. Valerie was standing over me, breathing heavily, staring down at my bleeding face with cold, calculating eyes. She did not offer a single word of apology. She simply adjusted her cashmere cardigan and told Chloe to step back so she would not ruin her designer shoes in the bloody mess. The boutique employees were frozen in absolute horror. One of the consultants fumbled for a phone, whispering frantically about calling an ambulance. But Marcus immediately barked at her to put the phone down. He told the terrified staff that it was just a minor family dispute and that I had clumsily tripped over my own feet. He actually looked down at me, bleeding heavily among the shattered glass, and told me to get up and stop making a dramatic scene because I was highly embarrassing him. He coldly ordered me to go to a local clinic and get it cleaned up quietly so I would not ruin the rest of their afternoon. I did not argue with him. I did not scream for help. The absolute betrayal was so profound and so unimaginably deep that it completely paralyzed my vocal cords. I slowly pulled myself up from the shattered glass, my blood dripping steadily onto the pristine white marble floor, leaving a horrific trail behind me. I walked out of that boutique on my own 2 feet, refusing the clean towels the terrified staff tried to hand me. I got into a cab and gave the shocked driver an extra $100 to ignore the blood on his seats while he drove me directly to the emergency room. The young nurse stopped wiping my neck. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with total disbelief and horror. She swallowed hard and asked me again if I was absolutely sure I did not want to call the police. I offered her a small, tight smile and slowly shook my head. I told her that calling the police would be far too easy. Sending Valerie to a holding cell for a few hours would not fix the underlying problem. My family did not fear the law because they arrogantly believed their church status and social standing made them untouchable. But there was one thing they worshipped far more than their public image. They worshipped money, specifically my money. And as I sat there in the hospital bed, looking at the financial portal on my glowing laptop screen, I knew exactly how to make them bleed. They cared more about a $50,000 bar tab and a white silk dress than they cared about my life. So I was going to systematically strip away every single luxury, every single asset, and every single dollar they thought they had secured. The nurse quietly packed up her medical supplies and stepped out of the curtained bay, leaving me completely alone to finish my ruthless work. I clicked the final confirmation button on my screen, officially withdrawing my financial guarantee for their massive mortgage. The digital gears of the banking system began turning, permanently locking them out of their dream home. The assault at the bridal shop was the absolute worst mistake Valerie ever made, because she did not just break my skin. She broke the only financial lifeline holding her entire fake world together. My laptop screen went dark just as my cell phone began vibrating violently against the metal hospital tray table. The harsh buzzing sound cut through the quiet isolation of my curtained bay. I leaned over and picked up the device. The caller ID flashed with my father's name. I let it ring. I had absolutely no desire to hear the frantic, desperate lies he was probably spinning to protect his new fiancée. The ringing stopped, and a few seconds later, a text message notification popped up on the illuminated screen. I opened the message and read the words carefully. Valerie is panicking because of you. The doctor says you are fine. Do not make a big deal out of this. Stay away from us until the wedding and the house closing are done. I stared at the glowing white text against the dark background. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words was almost breathtaking. He had clearly called the hospital front desk and badgered a nurse or a resident into confirming my physical status. He did not do this out of fatherly concern. He did it to assess his own level of liability. He needed to know if I was injured badly enough to trigger a police investigation that would drag his pristine reputation through the local news. Marcus was a highly respected elder in our church community. He spent his Sundays preaching about grace, forgiveness, and family unity while wearing custom-tailored suits. The absolute last thing he wanted was the congregation finding out that his future wife had violently assaulted his own daughter in a luxury bridal boutique. I read the text message a second time. There was no apology. There was no inquiry about my pain or my well-being. There was only a cold, calculated demand to disappear, so I would not cast a dark shadow over their upcoming celebrations. They wanted the convenience of my money without the burden of my presence. A slow, icy smirk spread across my face, pulling slightly at the fresh stitches on my forehead. Any lingering traces of childhood guilt or daughterly obligation completely evaporated from my body. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not draft a massive, angry paragraph detailing my trauma. I simply tapped the glass keyboard and replied with a single word. All right. 7 letters. One simple word. But it held the weight of an absolute death sentence for their entire fake reality. By typing that word, I was formally accepting his terms of banishment. He wanted me to stay away from the family. He wanted me to make myself scarce. I was more than happy to oblige. But what Marcus completely failed to realize was that when you banish the architect, you also lose the entire foundation of the castle. My single-word reply was not a surrender. It was a receipt. It was the official starting gun of a war they did not even know they were fighting yet. I slipped the phone back into my leather handbag just as Dr. Evans returned to my bay. He held a crisp white document in his hand. He looked at me with a mixture of professional detachment and quiet concern. I asked him earlier to provide a detailed certified medical report, and he had clearly taken my request very seriously. He handed me the paper, and I scanned the clinical text. The language was perfect. It detailed the exact length and depth of the laceration, the required 7 stitches, and the clear evidence of severe blunt force trauma. Most importantly, the official hospital stamp and his bold signature sat at the bottom of the page, legally classifying the incident as a second-degree physical assault. I thanked him politely, folded the crisp paper into perfect thirds, and slid it into the secure interior pocket of my bag. This single piece of paper was far more dangerous than a loaded weapon. It was a ticking time bomb waiting patiently in my purse for the absolute perfect moment to detonate. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up. The room spun for a fraction of a second, but I forced myself to remain completely steady. I smoothed down the ruined, blood-stained fabric of my silk blouse and walked out of the emergency room with my head held high. The automatic sliding doors parted, opening out into the freezing Chicago night. The cold wind hit my face, but it felt incredibly refreshing. I pulled up a luxury rideshare application on my phone and requested an executive black car to take me back to my downtown penthouse. As I stood on the concrete curb waiting for my driver, I thought about the precise timeline of their impending destruction. Today was Tuesday. The final closing date for their spectacular $1.5 million dream home was scheduled for this coming Friday afternoon. Valerie had already mailed out massive gold foil-stamped invitations to everyone in their social circle. She was planning to host a lavish housewarming and engagement party combination event on the front lawn of the property this weekend. She wanted to flaunt a magnificent house she did not legally own, using money she absolutely did not have to impress people who secretly despised her. She thought she had secured the ultimate prize. She thought she had successfully pushed the annoying stepdaughter out of the picture while keeping her hands firmly wrapped around my credit score. The sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, interrupting my thoughts. I opened the heavy door and climbed into the pristine leather interior. I gave the driver my address and leaned back against the plush seat. As the glittering lights of the downtown skyline blurred past the tinted windows, my phone vibrated one more time. It was an automated email notification from the executive banking portal. The message confirmed that my formal withdrawal, as the financial guarantor, had been successfully processed. The mandatory 72-hour account freeze was now officially active. The bank underwriters were already sharpening their knives, preparing to tear into Marcus and his ruined credit history. The game had officially begun, and I was holding every single winning card. The executive black SUV pulled up to the secured entrance of my downtown high-rise building. I stepped out into the biting Chicago wind and walked past the nodding night concierge directly to the private resident elevator. The heavy metallic doors slid shut, and I rode up to the penthouse level in total silence. Stepping into my apartment always felt like entering a heavily fortified sanctuary. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the glittering city skyline, but tonight I barely noticed the gorgeous view. I walked straight to the massive kitchen island, dropped my designer leather bag on the pristine marble counter, and poured myself a generous glass of expensive aged bourbon. The golden amber liquid burned the back of my throat, providing a sharp grounding contrast to the dull throbbing pain echoing inside my head. I sat down on a leather bar stool, pulled my high-security corporate laptop from my bag, and flipped open the lid. The screen flared to life, casting a cool blue glow over my face and illuminating the thick white bandage secured to my forehead. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password and placed my thumb firmly on the biometric scanner. The system authenticated my credentials and instantly granted me access to the highest proprietary tier of the banking network. As the Director of Credit Risk Management, I do not just look at monthly bank statements or simple checking accounts. I look at the absolute unvarnished truth of who people really are. People can easily lie to their friends, they can lie to their pastors, and they can certainly lie to their families, but they can never lie to the numbers. In my executive position, I oversee the approval and denial of massive multi-million-dollar corporate and residential loans. I manage an entire department of aggressive financial underwriters whose sole job is to dissect a person's financial soul and find the hidden rot. And right now, I was staring directly at the rotting foundation of my father's deeply fabricated life. I clicked a few keys and pulled up the pending mortgage application for Marcus and Valerie. A high-resolution photograph of the property immediately appeared on my screen. It was a spectacular $1.5 million sprawling brick estate located in an exclusive gated community in the wealthy northern suburbs. It boasted 6 bedrooms, a custom-built chef kitchen, a massive circular driveway, and a beautifully manicured backyard perfect for hosting large, extravagant church gatherings. It was the exact type of house deliberately designed to make other people incredibly jealous. Valerie had spent the last 2 months aggressively bragging to every single person in our social circle about her magnificent new home, conveniently leaving out the fact that she had absolutely no legal right to step foot on the property. I scrolled down past the shiny property photos and opened the deeply hidden credit reports attached to the official loan file. This was the specific part of the story Marcus desperately wanted to keep buried from the world. 5 years ago, before Valerie entered the picture, my father had a highly respectable credit score. He was a careful man who paid his bills on time and kept his credit balances relatively low. But Valerie was a completely different breed of financial parasite. Since she moved into his rented house, she had systematically bled him dry. I looked at the long, cascading list of severe derogatory marks staining his credit file. There were 5 different credit cards completely maxed out under his name. There were high-interest personal loans taken out to fund luxurious island vacations and designer handbags. Valerie had even secretly financed a luxury vehicle using his social security number, hiding the late payment notices in the bottom of the trash can. His debt-to-income ratio was an absolute undeniable nightmare. By all traditional banking standards, Marcus was completely toxic. Any entry-level loan officer would have taken one single look at his catastrophic credit profile and laughed him right out of the branch. The automated underwriting software should have instantly generated a massive red denial letter preventing them from ever making an offer on that estate. But they were not denied. In fact, they were conditionally approved and scheduled to officially close the deal in just 3 days. I scrolled to the very bottom of the digital file to the single line of data that made this entire fraudulent fairy tale possible. There in bold black letters was my name, Kiara Davis, primary guarantor. My pristine credit score of 815, combined with my substantial executive salary and massive liquid assets, was the absolute only reason the bank had agreed to fund the $1.5 million purchase. I was the solid steel beam holding up their entire fragile house of cards. Marcus had practically begged me to co-sign the loan 6 months ago, claiming it was just a temporary legal formality, until Valerie sold some mysterious piece of inherited land. It was a blatant lie, of course. There was no inherited land and there was absolutely no backup money. They desperately needed me to secure the loan, and once the legal papers were signed, they fully intended to treat me like a disposable stepping stone. They thought because I was the desperate daughter always seeking her father's conditional approval, I would just quietly absorb the massive financial risk while they lived like absolute royalty. But looking at the glowing screen now with fresh medical stitches in my head and my own blood still staining my expensive clothes, I felt nothing but absolute power. I was not a victim cowering in the shadows. I was the architect of their impending destruction. I moved my cursor over the digital authorization form. In the high-stakes banking world, a co-signer is essentially taking on the full legal responsibility of the debt. But until the final closing documents are signed in wet ink and the funds are officially dispersed, a co-signer retains the absolute legal right to withdraw their support at any given moment without any penalty. It was a lethal financial loophole that Valerie, in all her arrogant ignorance, knew absolutely nothing about. She was too busy planning her expensive champagne reception to understand the fundamental ruthless laws of high finance. I took another slow sip of my bourbon, letting the soothing warmth spread through my chest. I watched the bright red digital flag pop up on the mortgage file, indicating that my automated email from the hospital had officially triggered the mandatory underwriter review. Tomorrow morning, a junior analyst in my department was going to open this file, see the sudden withdrawal of the primary guarantor, and immediately hit the panic button. The entire $1.5 million loan was going to instantly collapse in on itself. And the most beautiful part of it all was that I did not have to say a single word to my father. I did not have to scream or argue or defend myself. I just had to sit back in my quiet penthouse, sip my expensive bourbon, and let the cold, unforgiving gears of the American banking system do all the dirty work for me. I set my empty crystal glass down on the pristine marble kitchen island and stood up from the leather bar stool. The adrenaline was still humming through my veins, carrying a cold and calculated energy that made the throbbing pain in my forehead feel completely insignificant. I began to pace across the expansive hardwood floors of my penthouse living room. My bare feet made absolutely no sound as I walked back and forth in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The glittering lights of downtown Chicago stretched out before me, forming a sprawling grid of power and money. In this city, you either write the rules or you get completely crushed by them. My family had spent my entire life trying to crush me under the heavy weight of their demands and expectations, but tonight I was officially rewriting the rules. I walked back to the kitchen island and stared down at the glowing laptop screen. The automated red flag I had triggered from the hospital was just a preliminary warning to the system. It was the digital equivalent of locking the front door. Now it was time to completely burn the building to the ground. I opened my highly secure corporate email client and started drafting a direct priority message to the senior underwriting manager and the chief closing attorney handling the residential file. In the ruthless world of high finance, the specific language you use is absolutely critical. There is no room for emotion or family drama. There is only cold, hard legal terminology. I kept my posture perfectly straight as my fingers flew across the keyboard. I typed out the official subject line, marking it as a critical and immediate legal action. I formally stated that effective immediately, I, Kiara Davis, was irrevocably withdrawing my consent, my financial backing, and my authorized signature as the primary guarantor for the residential mortgage application attached to my father's name. I cited the specific federal lending statutes that granted me the absolute right to terminate my financial involvement prior to the final disbursement of funds. I typed out the words with surgical precision, ensuring there was absolutely no legal loophole or margin for error. I was not asking for a favor, and I was not making a gentle request. I was issuing a legally binding corporate directive that could not be ignored. I paused for a fraction of a second, hovering my finger over the smooth glass trackpad. I thought about Valerie standing in that luxury bridal boutique, wearing her expensive cashmere cardigan, staring down at my bleeding face with pure, unadulterated contempt. I thought about Marcus, my own father, rushing to protect a white silk dress from blood splatters, instead of checking to see if his daughter was seriously injured. They threw me away like garbage because they arrogantly assumed my money was already safely locked in their bank accounts. I pressed down on the trackpad and hit send. The email vanished from my outbox and landed directly on the secure servers of the senior underwriting department. The immediate technical consequences of that single email were beautifully devastating. The banking software instantly reacted to the sudden withdrawal of the primary guarantor. The status of their pristine $1.5 million loan immediately shifted from a bright green clear to close to a glaring red suspended pending critical review. This automatic system trigger initiated a mandatory federal lending freeze that would last for exactly 72 hours. For the next 3 days, absolutely nothing could move. No funds could be wired to the escrow account. No title transfers could be legally processed. The closing attorneys were strictly barred from printing the final closing paperwork. The massive gears of the real estate transaction slammed to a complete and total halt. The freeze did not just stop the bank, it sent automated warning flags directly to the title company, the home sellers, and the real estate brokerage. Brad, my arrogant future brother-in-law, was listed as the buying agent on the digital file. His lucrative commission check, his highly anticipated payday, was now permanently locked inside a burning building. But the temporary freeze was only the very beginning of their nightmare. By removing myself from the equation, I had effectively ripped the protective financial blanket right off my father's file. The automated underwriting algorithm immediately began reassessing Marcus based solely on his own individual merit. Without my pristine 815 credit score to artificially inflate the average, the system grabbed his disastrous credit history and ran a fresh hard pull. It was an absolute financial massacre. I watched the live data actively updating on my screen as the algorithm aggressively recalculated his debt-to-income ratio. Without my executive salary buffering the numbers, his ratio instantly skyrocketed past 80%. The system immediately flagged the 5 maxed-out credit cards Valerie had secretly opened under his name. It highlighted the high-interest personal loans, the missed payments, and the hidden luxury car financing. The algorithmic risk assessment score plummeted deep into the toxic red zone. In a matter of mere seconds, my father went from being a highly qualified luxury homebuyer to a severe financial liability who could not even qualify to finance a used economy car. I resumed my pacing, walking slowly along the edge of my quiet living room. I felt a deep, profound sense of satisfaction settling heavily into my chest. Tomorrow morning, an entire team of loan officers was going to wake up and read my legal email. They were going to look at the massive crater where my financial guarantee used to be, and they were going to immediately terminate the entire deal. The bank would be forced by federal regulations to issue an official letter of denial. The ultimate irony was that Marcus and Valerie were probably fast asleep right now, resting peacefully in their rented house. Valerie was likely dreaming about her lavish champagne reception and picking out expensive custom window treatments for a house she was never going to own. Marcus was probably patting himself on the back, believing he had successfully bullied his annoying daughter into complete submission. They truly believed they had won. They thought they had perfectly orchestrated the ultimate family grift. They had absolutely no idea that a massive financial guillotine was currently suspended directly over their heads, just waiting to drop. The bank would not alert them tonight. The automated systems do not send out courtesy text messages at midnight to warn fraudsters. The blissful silence was going to stretch out for a few more days, allowing them to continue their arrogant bragging and their expensive party planning. I stopped pacing and looked at my faint reflection in the dark glass of the window. I touched the white bandage on my forehead, feeling the dull ache of the stitches. They demanded that I stay completely away from them. I fully intended to give them exactly what they asked for. But I was going to make sure that my sudden absence was the most painful and financially destructive thing they had ever experienced. My phone began to vibrate violently against the smooth marble surface of the kitchen island, completely shattering the quiet tranquility of my penthouse. I glanced down at the glowing screen and saw the name flashing in bright white letters. It was Brad. He was Chloe's 28-year-old fiancé and the official real estate broker, representing Marcus and Valerie on the $1.5 million house purchase. Brad was a thoroughly mediocre white man who possessed an astonishing amount of unearned confidence. He was the kind of guy who wore expensive loafers without socks, aggressively used corporate buzzwords he barely understood, and truly believed his wealthy parents paying for his real estate license made him a financial genius. I reached out and tapped the green accept button, placing the call on speakerphone so I would not have to press the cold glass against my fresh stitches. I leaned back against the counter, crossing my arms over my chest, and let his loud, booming voice fill my quiet kitchen. "Kiara, listen to me." He started immediately, his tone dripping with thick condescension. "Valerie just called me in an absolute panic about some ridiculous catfight you two had at the boutique today. I do not care who started it, and I do not care whose feelings got hurt. I am calling to make sure you are not going to let your little emotional outburst ruin a massive commercial transaction." I stared at the phone in absolute silence. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if my head was properly bandaged, or if I had suffered a severe concussion when his future mother-in-law shoved me through a glass table. He reduced a violent second-degree physical assault to a silly emotional catfight. His only concern was the real estate transaction. He viewed my family entirely as a stepping stone for his own financial gain, and he viewed me as nothing more than a stubborn obstacle he needed to firmly manage. When I did not immediately respond, Brad let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. It was the universal sound of an arrogant man preparing to explain something very simple to a woman he believed was vastly intellectually inferior. "Look, Kiara, I know you work in a bank doing whatever corporate paperwork you do," he continued, his voice taking on a slow, patronizing rhythm. "But real estate is a completely different beast. It is a highly complex world, and you probably do not fully grasp the intricate moving parts of a deal this size. When you co-sign a mortgage, you are legally binding yourself to the escrow process. You cannot just throw a temper tantrum and walk away because you got your feelings hurt shopping for dresses. If you try to back out now, you will completely crash the underwriting process and ruin the closing timeline." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a dark, cold amusement washing over me. I was a director of credit risk management. I literally wrote the standard operating procedures that governed the underwriting process he was currently trying to mansplain to me. I managed a massive department of senior financial analysts who would eat a junior broker like Brad for breakfast. Yet here he was, a guy who had sold exactly 3 houses in his entire amateur career, arrogantly lecturing me on the mechanics of high-level finance simply because he could not fathom a black woman holding more institutional power than he did. Brad did not wait for me to defend myself. He was far too enamored with the sound of his own voice. He plowed right ahead, completely eager to outline his grand master plan. You need to leave your name on those final closing documents, Kiara. You are going to do this because I am structuring a highly lucrative secondary deal, and I need your pristine credit score to anchor the primary asset. I narrowed my eyes, staring hard at the glowing phone. A secondary deal. He was venturing into highly dangerous territory, and he was entirely too stupid to realize it. I kept my voice perfectly flat and intentionally soft, playing directly into his assumption that I was intimidated. What exactly do you mean by a secondary deal, Brad? He let out a short, arrogant chuckle. It is called cross-collateralization, Kiara. It is an advanced investment strategy. You see, Marcus and Valerie think they are just buying a pretty house to live in. But I am the broker of record, and I wrote a very specific contingency clause into their purchasing agreement. Once the bank clears the $1.5 million loan using your credit profile, I am going to immediately leverage the newly acquired equity in that house to secure a massive commercial line of credit for my new real estate startup. He was speaking rapidly now, clearly thrilled by his own perceived brilliance. I need significant seed capital to launch my new brokerage firm. No bank is going to lend me that kind of cash without hard assets to back it up. So I am going to use your father's new house as the collateral for my corporate loan. Marcus already agreed to sign the secondary authorization papers because I told him it was standard procedure for the primary broker. He has absolutely no idea what it actually means, and frankly, neither does Valerie. They are just happy to get the keys. The sheer audacity of his confession hung heavily in the quiet air of my kitchen. Brad was openly admitting to orchestrating a massive predatory financial scheme against his own future in-laws. He was planning to secretly encumber their primary residence with a high-risk commercial loan to fund his failing startup dreams. If his little business venture went bankrupt, the commercial lenders would immediately foreclose on the house, leaving Marcus and Valerie completely homeless, and leaving me the primary guarantor legally responsible for the entire $1.5 million deficit. He actually thought he was a visionary. He thought he was outsmarting the entire banking system by using a black family as his personal financial shield. Listen, Kiara, he said, his voice dropping into a sleazy conspiratorial whisper. If you just keep your mouth shut, leave your signature on the loan documents, and let this deal close on Friday, I will cut you in. I will give you a solid 2% equity stake in my new startup company as a thank you for anchoring the credit profile. Consider it a favor from your new brother-in-law. 2% could be worth a lot of money someday. You just have to be a good girl and stop causing drama for Valerie. I reached out and gently traced the rim of my empty crystal bourbon glass. Brad had just handed me the absolute perfect weapon to completely destroy his entire professional career. He was actively attempting to commit textbook mortgage fraud. He was manipulating a residential loan application to secure undisclosed commercial funding, and he was trying to bribe a bank executive to facilitate the crime. He was so blinded by his own towering white privilege and his deep-seated misogyny that he never once considered I might be dangerous. He thought I was just a bitter sister-in-law who needed to be put in her place. He had absolutely no idea that he was currently swimming in a pool filled entirely with gasoline, and he had just gleefully handed me a lit match. I reached across the cool marble counter with my free hand and silently swiped open the screen of my corporate tablet. I quickly tapped the highly sensitive audio recording application and watched the bright red circle illuminate the dark digital display. The timer started ticking upward, capturing every single syllable echoing through my quiet kitchen. In the highly regulated corporate banking industry, we are taught to document absolutely everything to protect the institution. But right now, I was not acting as a bank executive protecting a faceless corporation. I was acting as a lethal predator baiting a highly arrogant trap. I intentionally softened my voice, injecting a slight tremor of hesitation to make myself sound nervous and completely out of my depth. Brad, I am just a little confused, I said slowly, pacing my words to sound submissive. I only work with standard credit algorithms. I do not understand the actual closing logistics of a deal this size. How can you legally take out a commercial loan on a residential property before the ink is even dry on the primary mortgage? Will the bank underwriters not see the secondary application and stop the process? Brad let out a loud, exasperated sigh that vibrated harshly through the phone speaker. He sounded exactly like a frustrated college professor forced to explain basic addition to a slow toddler. Listen carefully, Kiara, because I am only going to explain this once, he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. As the licensed broker of record, I completely control the flow of the closing documents between the title company and your bank. I have established a separate limited liability company specifically for my startup. I am submitting the secondary commercial application through a completely different private lender who does not communicate with the primary residential underwriters. He was giving me pure gold, but I needed him to explicitly spell out the intentional deception to make the fraud charges stick permanently. I leaned closer to the tablet, ensuring the microphone picked up my next question perfectly. But what about Marcus and Valerie? I asked, feigning innocent daughterly concern. Do they not have to sign the commercial lien documents in front of a licensed state notary? How are you getting around their physical signatures on the secondary loan? Brad actually laughed out loud. It was a cold, calculating sound that completely exposed his absolute lack of basic human morality. Oh, please, he scoffed, dismissing my question entirely. Marcus is so desperate to show off this massive brick mansion to his wealthy church friends that he signs absolutely anything I put in front of him. I slipped the commercial authorization forms into the massive stack of standard residential disclosures yesterday afternoon. I told him they were just routine broker liability waivers required by the state. He barely glanced at the paper before scribbling his name. The notary was a buddy of mine from college who did not ask any annoying questions. I stared at the blinking red light on my tablet, feeling a chilling sense of profound triumph. He had just openly confessed on crystal-clear audio to document misrepresentation, notary fraud, and a blatant breach of fiduciary duty. He had intentionally deceived his own clients to secretly encumber their primary residence. If the State Real Estate Commission heard even 10 seconds of this recording, they would permanently strip his license and refer him directly to the federal authorities. But I was not finished yet. I wanted him to hang himself with the absolute thickest rope possible, so there would be no escaping the consequences. So let me make sure I am understanding this perfectly, Brad, I said, keeping my tone completely flat and agreeable. You are using my pristine credit profile to secure a $1.5 million residential loan for my father. Then you are secretly using that new equity to secure a high-risk commercial loan for your new business venture under a hidden corporate entity. And if your startup company fails, the commercial lender will immediately foreclose on the house, leaving Marcus and Valerie completely bankrupt and leaving me legally responsible for the entire massive debt. There was a brief pause on the line. For a fleeting second, I thought he might actually realize how incredibly illegal and dangerous his master plan sounded when spoken out loud. But his towering white privilege and blind arrogance completely shielded him from any sense of reality. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the room. That is exactly right, Kiara. He confirmed, his voice brimming with sickening pride. But my startup is not going to fail. I am a visionary. This is just creative corporate financing. This is exactly how wealthy people leverage assets to build massive empires. You just need to stay in your little banking cubicle, keep your mouth shut, and leave your signature on the primary loan. Do that, and you get your 2% equity stake. Do we have a deal? I looked at the digital timer on the recording application. 4 minutes and 12 seconds of absolute, undeniable criminal evidence. I had everything I needed to destroy his entire career and ensure he never stepped foot inside a real estate brokerage ever again. Yes, Brad, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. We have a deal. I will leave my name exactly where it belongs. Excellent, he replied, a smug smile practically audible in his voice. I knew you were smart enough to see the bigger picture. Stop causing unnecessary drama with Valerie and let the adults handle the heavy lifting. I will see you at the housewarming party on Friday. The line went dead with a sharp click. The heavy silence rushed back into my penthouse, but the energy in the room had completely shifted. I reached out and tapped the red square on my tablet, officially stopping the recording. I immediately uploaded the high-definition audio file to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers and emailed a backup copy directly to my personal secure drive. Brad was an absolute fool. He told me to leave my name exactly where it belonged, and I fully intended to honor that specific promise. My name belonged at the very top of a formal criminal complaint submitted to the State Real Estate Licensing Board. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of financial chess, but he did not even realize I had already flipped the entire board upside down. I opened a new browser window on my laptop and navigated directly to the official government portal for reporting predatory lending practices and broker ethics violations. I began typing out his full legal name, his active broker license number, and the exact details of the massive mortgage fraud he had just cheerfully explained to me. I attached the audio recording directly to the digital complaint file and checked the box requesting an immediate emergency injunction citing severe imminent financial harm to the primary borrowers. Brad was completely convinced he was the untouchable mastermind of a brilliant corporate scheme. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you try to outsmart a woman who builds and destroys financial portfolios for a living. I clicked the final submit button, closed the laptop, and took a sip of my bourbon. The trap was perfectly set, and the countdown to the Friday housewarming party had officially begun. Sunday afternoon arrived with a heavy blanket of gray clouds hanging low over the Chicago skyline. I parked my car along the cracked concrete curb outside the modest split-level rental house my father currently called home. For the past 5 years, this house had been a mandatory weekly pilgrimage. Sunday dinner was Marcus's favorite stage to play the benevolent patriarch for his church friends, while subtly reminding me of all my supposed flaws. But today, as I walked up the uneven pavement toward the front door, I did not feel the familiar heavy knot of childhood anxiety twisting in my stomach. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, clinical anticipation of a hunter watching their prey walk willingly into a steel trap. I pushed open the front door without knocking. The immediate wave of suffocating heat and the heavy smell of roasted meat and strong spices hit my face. The house was cramped and cluttered, filled with cheap decorative items Valerie had purchased to simulate wealth. I stood in the narrow entryway, slowly unbuttoning my wool coat, taking in the scene playing out in the cramped living room. It was a perfectly staged tableau of a happy family, waiting to ascend to their rightful throne. Brad was standing directly in the center of the room holding a bottle of cheap domestic beer, like it was a flute of vintage champagne. He was already loudly holding court, dominating the conversation with aggressive hand gestures. Marcus was sitting in his worn leather recliner, leaning forward and hanging on to absolutely every single word Brad said, as if the mediocre real estate broker was delivering a sermon straight from the mountaintop. Valerie was hovering near the kitchen archway, wearing a pristine floral apron over her Sunday dress, looking like the ultimate devoted homemaker. And then there was Chloe. She was sprawled lazily across the floral sofa, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and her eyes immediately locked onto me, her lips curled into a sharp, practiced sneer. "Well, look who decided to finally show up," she announced loudly, ensuring the entire room stopped to look at me. The booming conversation in the living room immediately died. Marcus turned his head and gave me a stiff, disapproving nod. There was no warm embrace. There was no worried, fatherly inquiry about the fresh white medical bandage taped securely above my left eyebrow. His dark eyes simply flashed with a silent, heavy warning, telling me to keep my mouth shut and play my assigned role. I stepped into the living room, smoothing down the front of my clothing. I had intentionally chosen a high-necked black cashmere sweater and tailored charcoal trousers. The dark colors contrasted sharply with the bright pastel dresses Valerie and Chloe always wore to church. Chloe let out a loud theatrical sigh and tossed her phone onto the sofa cushions. "Seriously, Kiara?" she groaned, rolling her eyes. Could you possibly look any more depressing? We are supposed to be celebrating our massive new house today, and you show up looking like you are attending a corporate funeral. And that massive bandage is completely ruining the aesthetic of the room. Could you not have found some expensive concealer to cover that up? I looked directly at her spoiled, entitled face. It was almost breathtaking how easily she dismissed the fact that her own mother had violently shoved me into a glass table less than 48 hours ago. They had completely rewritten the narrative in their own heads. In their twisted version of reality, I was just being dramatic and inconvenient. I did not raise my voice. I simply stared at her with dead, flat eyes. "It is a medical bandage, Chloe," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Doctors generally frown upon rubbing cheap drugstore makeup directly into deep, open wounds. Valerie visibly stiffened by the kitchen door, her hands gripping the edge of her floral apron. Brad immediately stepped in to break the tension, puffing out his chest and flashing me a bright, arrogant smile. He walked over and clapped me hard on the shoulder, exactly the way a coach would slap a bench warmer. "Come on now, ladies, let us keep the peace," Brad declared, loudly acting as the great white savior of the family dynamic. "Today is a day for massive celebration. I just got off the phone with the title agency on Friday. Everything is moving along perfectly for the big closing. By this time next week, we will all be drinking top-shelf liquor in a $1.5 million mansion." He shot me a quick, sleazy wink. It was a silent, sickening acknowledgement of our secret phone call from the night before. He truly believed he had successfully bribed me into complete compliance. He thought my silence today was absolute proof that his ridiculous 2% equity offer had worked. He had absolutely no idea that I had already forwarded his recorded confession to the state licensing board and that his entire professional career was currently burning to the ground. Marcus clapped his hands together, his face beaming with absolute pride. "That is exactly right, Brad." My father boomed, his voice echoing loudly in the small room. "You are an absolute genius, son. I was just telling the elders at church this morning how incredibly blessed we are to have such a brilliant financial mind joining this family. You are taking us to the absolute next level." I stood quietly in the corner, watching the sickening display of blatant favoritism. Marcus was looking at Brad with the exact kind of deep, unconditional pride and admiration I had spent my entire childhood desperately trying to earn. I had graduated at the top of my university class. I had climbed the brutal corporate ladder to become a senior banking executive. I had built a massive portfolio of wealth entirely on my own. But Marcus never once looked at me the way he was looking at Brad right now. To my father, my success was just a convenient tool to be quietly exploited, while Brad was a shiny trophy to be proudly displayed. "Dinner is ready," Valerie announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Everyone take your seats in the dining room. Let us gather together and bless this wonderful food." We moved into the cramped dining space. The table was small, and they had specifically arranged the seating so that Brad and Marcus sat at the heads of the table, acting as the dual kings of the household. Valerie and Chloe took the prime seats on the sides, leaving me the broken, mismatched folding chair squeezed uncomfortably near the drafty window. It was a deliberate, calculated physical manifestation of exactly where I stood in this family hierarchy. I sat down on the hard metal chair and placed my linen napkin perfectly across my lap. Marcus bowed his head and began to deliver a long, booming prayer, thanking the heavens for their incredible new house and asking for continued financial blessings. I kept my eyes wide open, staring at the dry roast beef on my plate. I listened to my father thank a higher power for a mansion he was never going to legally own. I listened to him praise a fraudulent real estate broker who was actively trying to bankrupt him. I sat in the suffocating heat of the lion den, completely surrounded by people who despised me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of profound peace. They thought they had finally won. But they were just happily enjoying their final meal on death row. The heavy silence in the dining room stretched out uncomfortably as Marcus finally finished his booming prayer and aggressively sliced into the dry roast beef. For a few agonizing minutes, The only sounds were the scraping of cheap silverware against porcelain plates and Brad loudly chewing his food. I sat quietly in my drafty corner, carefully cutting my meat into small, precise squares. I could feel the collective tension in the room actively shifting. Everyone was stealing sideways glances at the prominent white medical bandage taped above my left eye. They were all waiting for the inevitable explosion. Valerie suddenly let out a loud, dramatic sniffle. It was the exact sound of a seasoned actress preparing to launch into a deeply rehearsed monologue. She placed her fork down with trembling hands and brought a delicate linen napkin up to her perfectly mascaraed eyes. "Oh my heavens," she whispered, her voice wavering with practiced fragility. "I simply cannot eat a single bite. My stomach is in absolute knots just looking at Kiara sitting over there so coldly." The entire table immediately stopped eating. Marcus reached over and gently patted Valerie's hand, his face etched with deep husbandly concern. Chloe leaned forward, glaring at me as if my mere existence was personally traumatizing her mother. Valerie took a deep, shuddering breath, ensuring she had the absolute undivided attention of every single person in the room. "Kiara, I have not slept a single wink since our little misunderstanding at the boutique," she cried, forcing two perfectly formed tears to spill down her cheeks. "You know I have been under an unimaginable amount of stress lately. Between planning Chloe's spectacular wedding and coordinating the massive move into our beautiful new mansion, my nerves are completely frayed. And on top of all that, my doctor says I am going through severe premenopause. My hormones are completely out of control, making me so incredibly clumsy and emotional." I slowly set my knife down on the table, staring at her in absolute disbelief. She was actually trying to blame a violent physical assault on a hormonal imbalance and wedding stress. She had shoved me with both hands directly into a solid glass table, but she was actively spinning a narrative where she was just a clumsy, overwhelmed victim of her own biology. "When you started raising your voice at me about the champagne reception," Valerie continued, her voice breaking pitifully, "I just panicked. I reached out to try and calm you down, and you just stumbled backward in those ridiculously high heels. It was a tragic, terrible accident, and seeing you bleed like that just broke my fragile heart into a million pieces." She completely buried her face in her hands, letting out a loud, theatrical sob. Marcus immediately stood up, wrapping his arms around her shaking shoulders and glaring fiercely across the table at me. The sheer audacity of her performance was almost impressive. She had managed to completely absolve herself of any violent intent, blame my shoes for the fall, and portray herself as the ultimate victim whose heart was broken by the sight of my blood. The room immediately rallied to her defense. Chloe reached across the table and fiercely gripped her mother's hand. "It is okay, Mom," Chloe cooed, shooting me a venomous look. "Everyone knows Kiara loves to play the victim and blow things completely out of proportion to get attention. You did nothing wrong." Brad cleared his throat, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed over his chest, looking at me like I was a highly disobedient child. "You know, Kiara?" He started, his tone thick with condescension. "Valerie has been nothing but incredibly welcoming to you since she joined this family. She has bent over backward trying to include you in these beautiful family milestones. The least you could do is show a little grace. You really upset her today by showing up with that massive bandage, acting all hostile, and ruining Sunday dinner. You owe her a massive apology for causing her so much emotional distress." I looked around the small, cramped dining table, my father, my future stepmother, my stepsister, and the arrogant broker actively trying to ruin them all. They were entirely united in their delusion. They were a solid, impenetrable wall of toxic enablement. In any normal family, a father would demand answers. He would demand accountability for the permanent scar currently healing on his daughter's forehead. But Marcus was not a normal father. He was a man who desperately prioritized his own comfort and his public image over his own flesh and blood. Marcus finally spoke, his deep voice echoing with absolute authority. "Brad is exactly right, Kiara. Your behavior today is incredibly sullen and disrespectful. Valerie is a good Christian woman who is doing her absolute best to hold this family together during a highly stressful transition. I will not tolerate you sitting there radiating hostility in my home." You will apologize to Valerie right now for upsetting her, and you will accept her heartfelt explanation. We are going to put this silly little incident completely behind us and move forward as a united, loving family." The heavy silence returned to the room as all four of them stared at me, waiting for my immediate submission. They expected me to lower my head, swallow my pride, and offer a groveling apology to the woman who put me in the emergency room. They expected the obedient little ATM machine to quickly dispense exactly what they demanded. I reached for my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. "You are absolutely right, Valerie," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "I am so incredibly sorry for causing you so much emotional distress. I can only imagine how truly difficult it must be to navigate the overwhelming stress of moving into such a massive, expensive new home while trying to plan a luxury wedding. I completely understand how those immense financial pressures could cause someone to accidentally lose their temper." Valerie immediately peeked out from behind her napkin, a relieved, victorious smile quickly replacing her fake tears. She thought she had won. She thought her ridiculous premenopause excuse had worked perfectly and that I had surrendered completely. "Thank you, Kiara," she sniffled, dabbing at her dry eyes. "I knew you would eventually understand. We just need to focus entirely on the beautiful future ahead of us." I offered her a small, chilling smile. "Oh, absolutely, Valerie," I agreed, leaning slightly forward in my hard metal chair. "The future is going to be incredibly revealing for all of us. I think we should definitely clear the air completely before the big closing date on Friday. After all, moving into a $1.5 million mansion requires everyone to be absolutely honest about what they bring to the table." Brad shifted slightly in his chair, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing his arrogant face. Marcus frowned, his heavy brows pulling together in slight confusion. They did not understand the quiet, lethal threat hidden in my words. They thought the conflict was over. They did not realize I had just locked the door to the slaughterhouse. Marcus let out a loud, booming laugh, completely misinterpreting my statement as absolute surrender. He clapped his large hands together, rubbing his palms in sheer delight. "That is exactly the kind of mature attitude I expect from my daughter," he declared, leaning back in his leather chair with a smug, satisfied grin. "We all need to bring our absolute best to the table to make this beautiful transition as smooth as possible. In fact, since you brought it up, there is a small matter of business we should finalize right now while we are all sitting together." He reached down beside his chair and hoisted his heavy leather briefcase onto his lap. The brass clasps clicked loudly in the quiet dining room. He opened the flap and pulled out a thick stack of crisp white legal documents stapled neatly at the top corner. He placed the heavy packet onto the wooden dining table directly next to his half-eaten plate of roast beef. He placed his thick index finger on the center of the top page and slowly slid the entire stack across the table. The paper made a sharp scratching sound against the polished wood until it stopped exactly in front of my water glass. I looked down at the document. The bold black letters at the very top of the page spelled out a formal financial authorization and a limited power of attorney agreement. I kept my face perfectly blank, but internally, my mind was racing with absolute disbelief. "Brad called me yesterday afternoon." Marcus began, his tone shifting into his fake professional business voice. "He told me the bank underwriters are moving a little slower than we anticipated with the final escrow clearances. Apparently, there are some unexpected processing fees and title insurance premiums that need to be cleared immediately to guarantee we get the keys by Friday afternoon. We cannot afford any careless administrative delays." I glanced up at Brad. The arrogant broker was sitting perfectly still, offering me a tight, warning nod. He was actively lying to my father. Brad knew exactly why the underwriters might be stalling, but he was using that fake excuse to extract even more money out of me before his fraudulent commercial loan scheme was finalized. "So, what exactly does this document have to do with me?" I asked, keeping my voice completely neutral. Marcus cleared his throat, adjusting his posture to look as authoritative as possible. The title agency requires a larger good faith deposit to expedite the final closing paperwork, he explained smoothly. Valerie and I have already completely tied up all of our liquid assets in the down payment and the moving expenses. We need you to transfer an additional $100,000 of your personal money directly into the escrow account first thing tomorrow morning. This document simply authorizes Brad to legally facilitate that specific wire transfer on your behalf. The sheer, unadulterated peak of their greed hit me like a physical wave. It was not enough that they were using my pristine 815 credit score to secure a $1.5 million mortgage. It was not enough that Valerie had just physically assaulted me and sent me to the emergency room. Now sitting here eating Sunday dinner, while the stitches on my forehead were still fresh, they were aggressively demanding a massive sum of my raw liquid cash to line their pockets. Valerie leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her fake tears completely forgotten. "It is really the absolute least you could do, Kiara," she said, her voice dripping with toxic entitlement. "Considering the massive emotional stress you caused me at the bridal boutique and those ridiculous medical bills we might have to help you cover later, you owe us a little peace of mind. Think of this transfer as a small compensation for the terrible inconvenience you caused the entire family this weekend. We just want to get into our new mansion without any more of your dramatic interruptions." Chloe snickered quietly from her side of the table, aggressively stabbing a piece of carrots with her fork. "Honestly, Kiara, if you are really a big fancy bank executive like you always brag about, $100,000 should be absolute pocket change for you," Chloe mocked. "Stop being so incredibly cheap and just help Dad close the deal." I looked back down at the legal document resting near my plate. I read the fine print printed beneath the authorization lines. It was a completely unrestricted escrow deposit form. Once that $100,000 hit the title company account, it would be legally absorbed into the primary transaction. They were not asking for a temporary loan. They were demanding a permanent cash gift to lower their monthly mortgage payments and artificially inflate the remaining equity. Brad needed that specific equity to be as high as possible so he could drain it instantly for his secret commercial startup loan. They were all participating in a massive coordinated financial vampire feeding frenzy, and I was their chosen target. Brad cleared his throat, deciding to add his own professional pressure to the conversation. "It is standard industry practice, Kiara," he lied effortlessly, flashing a brilliant white smile. "The underwriting algorithm loves to see heavy liquid reserves in the escrow account right before the final signature day. It guarantees a perfectly smooth closing process. And like I told you on the phone yesterday, keeping everything smooth is highly beneficial for your own secondary interests." He was openly referencing his illegal bribe right in front of my father, completely confident that Marcus was too economically illiterate to understand the underlying threat. Brad thought he held all the cards. He thought this document was the final masterful stroke of his brilliant real estate scheme. I slowly reached out and placed my hand flat against the crisp white paper. I could have laughed right in their faces. I could have slammed my fists on the table and screamed at them for their unbelievable audacity. But I was a senior risk manager, and I knew that the most dangerous move you can make in a high-stakes negotiation is tipping your hand before the final trap is fully sprung. They wanted $100,000 to ensure the house paperwork cleared faster. They wanted to feel completely victorious and utterly invincible for the next 4 days. I looked up, meeting my father's expectant, greedy eyes. "I understand completely," I said, my voice soft and incredibly agreeable. "You are absolutely right, Marcus. We cannot allow any administrative delays to ruin such a massive family milestone. I will happily provide the extra funds to secure the escrow account." Valerie let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, clutching her hands to her chest. Marcus beamed with absolute triumph, practically vibrating with pride. They had successfully bullied the golden goose into laying one final massive egg. They had no idea that the egg I was about to hand them was a highly volatile financial grenade, completely primed to detonate the second it reached the bank. I reached down into my leather handbag resting on the floor beside my uncomfortable metal chair. My fingers brushed past the official hospital injury report and closed securely around the cool, smooth leather of my personal checkbook. I pulled it out and placed it gently on the wooden dining table, right next to the massive stack of authorization documents Marcus had pushed toward me. I made sure to let out a soft, defeated sigh, letting my shoulders slump forward just a fraction of an inch. I needed them to believe that I was completely broken. I needed them to see a woman who had finally succumbed to the overwhelming emotional pressure and toxic guilt they had weaponized against me for my entire life. Marcus eagerly leaned across the table and practically shoved his heavy gold-plated fountain pen into my hand. His dark eyes were wide with naked greed, tracking my every single movement, like a starving animal watching a fresh piece of meat. Valerie was literally holding her breath, her hands clasped tightly under her chin, in a prayer of pure materialism. Even Chloe had stopped chewing her food, completely captivated by the sight of my leather checkbook. They had spent 3 decades trying to tear me down and make me feel worthless, but in this specific moment I was the absolute center of their entire universe. I clicked the heavy cap off the fountain pen and pressed the sharp metal nib against the thick, textured paper of the personal check. The dining room was so incredibly quiet, I could actually hear the sharp scratch of the metal gliding against the paper. I carefully wrote out the current date, my handwriting looping and elegant. Then I moved down to the payee line and wrote out the official corporate name of the title and escrow agency Brad had listed on the legal authorization form. Now came the amount. I moved my pen to the small rectangular box and wrote the number 1 followed by 5 perfectly round zeros. $100,000. I moved to the line below and wrote out the words, ensuring there was absolutely no ambiguity about the massive sum of liquid cash I was casually handing over. It was more money than my father made in 2 entire years of working, but to me, it was just the necessary cost of admission to watch their entire fake empire burn to the ground. Finally, I pulled the legal authorization document closer to me. This specific form required me to manually write out my bank routing number and my personal account number to authorize the title company to legally process the massive paper draft. This was the exact moment where the steel jaws of the trap would permanently snap shut. In the corporate banking industry, routing numbers are the absolute lifeblood of any financial transaction. They are a highly specific 9-digit code that directs the massive flow of money between institutional servers. If a routing number is perfectly accurate, the money flows smoothly, like water. But if even a single digit is incorrect, the entire banking system violently rejects the transaction. And when an escrow account rejects a $100,000 deposit just 3 days before a massive luxury real estate closing, it does not just send a polite error message, it automatically triggers a severe federal financial fraud alert. I kept my face perfectly blank, projecting a picture of total daughterly obedience. I carefully copied the first 4 digits of my routing number exactly as they appeared on my monthly bank statements. But when I reached the 5th digit, I intentionally hesitated. My actual routing number contained a solid 8. I pressed the gold fountain pen down hard and deliberately wrote a flawless number 3. I finished writing the rest of the numbers and quickly scrawled my signature at the very bottom of the check and the legal document. I executed the signature with a slight intentional tremble in my hand, perfectly selling the illusion that writing this massive amount was emotionally devastating for me. I slid the check and the signed authorization form back across the wooden table toward my father. Marcus snatched the papers with lightning speed, his thick fingers almost tearing the corners of the document. He did not even bother to look me in the eye or say thank you. He immediately handed the documents directly over to Brad, who was sitting at the other head of the table. Brad eagerly inspected the paperwork, his eyes rapidly scanning the 6-figure amount and my flawless signature. "Everything looks absolutely perfect, Kiara," Brad said, flashing me that sleazy, arrogant smile. "I will personally deliver this directly to the senior escrow officer first thing tomorrow morning. This is going to make the final underwriting process incredibly smooth. You made the absolute right choice today." I am so incredibly glad I could help, Valerie added, her voice rapidly returning to its sickeningly sweet pitch. You know, Kiara, when we get completely settled into the new mansion, you will have to come over for a nice quiet afternoon tea. Just the two of us. We can put all this ugly business completely behind us. I looked at her fake smiling face, and the fresh surgical stitches on my own forehead throbbed violently in response. I am absolutely sure you will be very busy unpacking, Valerie, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I slowly stood up from the hard metal chair and picked up my designer handbag. I did not stay for the dessert Valerie had baked. I did not linger to listen to them excitedly discuss their plans for the massive master suite or the luxury patio furniture they were going to buy on credit. I walked straight out of the cramped dining room, leaving their suffocating rented house without looking back. As I stepped out into the freezing Chicago evening, the heavy front door clicking shut behind me, a massive wave of dark, absolute satisfaction washed over my entire body. I walked to my car and slid into the quiet leather interior, starting the engine. Tomorrow morning, Brad was going to confidently strut into the title agency and hand them a piece of paper that was financially radioactive. The escrow officer would attempt to process the $100,000 draft, and the automated banking system would instantly hit a massive brick wall. The transposed routing number would cause a catastrophic hard bounce. In the ruthless world of high-end real estate, a bounced six-figure earnest money check is considered highly suspicious. The title agency would immediately freeze the entire escrow account. They would flag Brad as the submitting broker, initiating a mandatory ethics review of his professional license. The wealthy sellers of the $1.5 million mansion would be instantly notified that their buyers had just bounced a massive check. The sellers would immediately panic, assuming Marcus was completely broke, which of course he actually was, and because I had already officially withdrawn my signature as the primary guarantor, the banking underwriters were already preparing to officially deny the primary loan. The bounced check was just the final devastating nail in the coffin. It was a beautifully orchestrated sequence of catastrophic financial failure, perfectly designed to completely obliterate their arrogant dream. I pulled away from the cracked concrete curb, leaving the modest house behind me. They were currently sitting around the dining table, celebrating their incredible victory, completely unaware that I had just signed their absolute financial death warrant with a single drop of ink. The dominoes were officially in motion, and there was absolutely nothing any of them could do to stop the impending collapse. The engine of my car purred softly as I navigated the dark residential streets, leaving that suffocating neighborhood far behind me. My mind immediately replayed the final exquisite moments of my departure from their cramped dining room. Just before I had walked out the front door, I had pushed my uncomfortable metal chair away from the table and stood up to my full height. Looking down at the four of them sitting around the table clutching my fraudulent check, I felt an absolute and permanent shift in the power dynamic. From my vantage point, towering over them in my tailored black cashmere, they looked incredibly small. They looked exactly like greedy children playing a high-stakes game they did not even begin to understand. I had looked directly at my father and delivered my final parting words. I told them I wanted to congratulate them early on the beautiful new house. I kept my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of any sarcasm. I told them with absolute certainty that the bank would definitely be calling them by Friday. They did not hear the lethal warning hidden beneath my polite words. They only heard a defeated woman completely surrendering to their will. Marcus had let out a loud, booming laugh, waving his hand dismissively in my direction. He told me it was about time I finally did something truly useful for this family, instead of just bringing a dark cloud into every room I entered. Chloe had openly sneered at me, crossing her arms over her chest. She mocked my stiff posture and told me not to let the door hit me on the way out, clearly thrilled that the annoying black sheep of the family had finally been fully milked for every single dollar she was worth. Even Brad, the arrogant orchestrator of this massive disaster, had to get one last patronizing dig in. He tapped his index finger against the folded check resting on the table and told me to drive safely back to my lonely little apartment. He confidently assured me that the adults would take over from here and handle all the complicated financial heavy lifting. Valerie simply sat there playing the gracious victorious queen, offering me a fake sympathetic smile while her eyes gleamed with pure unadulterated greed. In the past, their cruel mockery would have crushed me. I would have stood there desperately trying to defend myself, arguing until my throat was raw, begging them to see my basic human value. I would have cried in the car all the way home, wondering why my own father hated me so much. But tonight I did not offer a single word of defense. I did not engage in their petty verbal attacks. I simply looked at their smug, satisfied faces and let them have the absolute last word. I allowed them to feel incredibly powerful and completely untouchable. Leaving in absolute silence was the most profound display of strength I had ever exercised in my entire life. When you know absolutely for a fact that the entire building is rigged with explosives, you do not stand around arguing with the people sitting inside. You simply smile, walk out the front door, and wait for the inevitable detonation. As I stepped out onto the cracked concrete porch, the freezing Chicago wind hit my face, but it felt remarkably like a warm embrace. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me permanently, severing the toxic tether that had bound me to Marcus and his family for 3 decades. The sharp, rhythmic sound of my stilettos hitting the pavement echoed in the quiet night air. A slow, highly satisfied smile began to creep across my face, pulling slightly at the fresh medical stitches above my left eye. The physical pain was still there, but it had transformed into a badge of absolute honor. It was the final physical toll I would ever pay for the terrible crime of being born to a man who did not know how to genuinely love me. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car, feeling an overwhelming surge of pure adrenaline. The drive back to downtown Chicago felt like a victory lap. The bright, glittering lights of the city skyline grew larger through my windshield, welcoming me back to the ruthless corporate world where I actually belonged. I was no longer the discarded daughter desperate for a seat at their cheap dining table. I was the executioner successfully returning to my castle. My mind began meticulously calculating the precise timeline of their impending destruction. First thing Monday morning, Brad would proudly march into the pristine offices of the title agency. He would hand over the check, completely confident that his illegal commercial loan scheme was perfectly secured. The escrow officer would scan the document and transmit the routing data to the federal banking servers. The digital transaction would hit the intentionally transposed routing number and violently rebound. By Wednesday, the massive earnest money deposit would be officially registered as a hard bounce. The title company would instantly freeze the escrow account and notify the sellers that Marcus was a severe financial risk. Meanwhile, my corporate department at the bank would officially process my withdrawal as the primary guarantor. The strict underwriting algorithm would tear through my father's disastrous credit file, exposing the maxed-out credit cards, the hidden auto loans, and the severe debt-to-income ratio Valerie had secretly built behind his back. And then Friday would arrive. Friday was the exact day Valerie had scheduled her lavish, spectacular housewarming and engagement party on the front lawn of a mansion she did not legally own. She had invited over 100 people from their prestigious church community to witness her grand ascension into high society. She wanted a massive audience to watch her show off her incredible newly acquired wealth. I smiled again, the deeply satisfied expression settling permanently into my features. She was definitely going to get her massive audience. But they were not going to witness a joyous celebration. They were going to have front-row tickets to the most spectacular and devastating financial collapse in the history of our community. I merged onto the highway, the tires of my car humming smoothly against the asphalt. The black sheep had officially left the slaughterhouse, and the wolves were about to starve. Friday afternoon arrived bathed in brilliant golden sunlight. The sprawling brick estate in the exclusive northern suburbs looked like a spectacular photograph ripped directly from the pages of a high-end architectural magazine. By all standard legal operating procedures, the massive wrought iron gates at the front of the driveway should have been locked tight. The final financial closing was not scheduled to be completely executed until 4 o'clock that afternoon. But Brad, being the arrogant, highly unethical broker that he was, had aggressively exploited a temporary use and occupancy loophole. He had convinced the selling agent to allow my family onto the manicured grounds a few hours early under the completely false pretense of setting up a few light staging decorations for the final walkthrough. They did not set up light decorations. They set up a full-blown kingdom. I parked my black executive SUV discreetly down the tree-lined street, sitting comfortably in the cool leather driver's seat with the dark-tinted windows rolled up. From my secure vantage point, I had a perfect, uninterrupted view of their massive, spectacular fraud playing out in real time. 3 massive white catering tents had been erected on the sprawling green front lawn. A small army of waiters dressed in crisp white shirts and black bow ties were weaving smoothly through the massive crowd, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with expensive crystal flutes of imported champagne and gourmet appetizers. Valerie had actually hired a live string quartet that was currently sitting on the wrap-around stone porch, aggressively playing elegant classical music. More than 100 guests had already arrived and parked their luxury cars along the street. They were mostly the prominent elders, wealthy parishioners, and influential community leaders from Marcus's church, the exact people Valerie was desperately trying to impress and socially dominate. It was a masterclass in pure, unadulterated financial delusion. Valerie was holding court near the massive stone water fountain in the center of the circular driveway. She was wearing a completely ridiculous bright yellow designer silk dress that she had undoubtedly charged to one of the hidden maxed-out credit cards, slowly drowning my father's credit report. A massive diamond pendant sparkled aggressively on her chest as she laughed loudly, tossing her head back and accepting the endless stream of breathless compliments from the envious church ladies. She was loudly bragging about the imported Italian marble countertops and the custom mahogany cabinets inside the house, speaking as if she had personally overseen the architectural design. She looked exactly like a woman who believed she had successfully conquered the world and secured her permanent place in high society. Marcus was standing a few feet away, playing the ultimate role of the benevolent, wealthy patriarch to absolute perfection. He was wearing a custom-tailored 3-piece charcoal suit, gripping an expensive imported cigar securely between his bright white teeth. He was loudly patting men on the back, shaking hands, and delivering an impromptu booming testimony right there on the driveway. I could hear his deep voice carrying over the gentle music, claiming that his incredible financial discipline and his unwavering religious faith had miraculously manifested this magnificent $1.5 million estate. The church elders were nodding solemnly, completely eating out of the palm of his hand, entirely blind to the massive financial rot hiding just beneath the surface of his expensive suit. Brad and Chloe were stationed near the towering mahogany front double doors, acting as the official royal gatekeepers to the castle. Brad was wearing a slick pastel blue linen suit, loudly handing out his glossy premium real estate business cards to absolutely anyone who made eye contact with him. He was shamelessly using my father's fake house as a giant live-action billboard for his fraudulent commercial startup company. I watched him corner a wealthy church deacon, aggressively dropping corporate real estate buzzwords and actively trying to recruit the older man as a primary investor for his new brokerage firm. Brad was pointing at the massive brick house, using it as physical proof of his unparalleled real estate genius. Chloe was clinging tightly to his arm, wearing a white designer outfit that probably cost more than her entire college tuition, looking down her nose at the arriving guests, as if they were peasants entering her royal kingdom. They were all completely intoxicated by their own fabricated success. They were actively celebrating a massive victory that did not actually exist, drinking expensive champagne paid for with stolen money on a manicured lawn they were currently legally trespassing on. They had built an entire towering monument to their own vanity and greed, completely funded by the assumption that I would quietly absorb the massive financial risk and disappear into the shadows, just like Marcus had commanded me to do. I looked down at the glowing digital clock on my dashboard. It was exactly 2:45 in the afternoon. The federal banking underwriters officially closed their final corporate files for the weekend at exactly 3 o'clock. The massive earnest money check Brad had so confidently delivered to the title agency on Monday morning had already violently bounced through the federal clearinghouse. The automated mortgage freeze I had triggered from the hospital bed had completely expired, unleashing the full brutal reality of Marcus's toxic credit report directly onto the desks of the senior lending committee. I reached out and took a slow, refreshing sip of my iced coffee. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no pity. I was simply a highly trained risk manager watching a catastrophic mathematical equation finally balance itself out. The live string quartet continued to drag their bows across their instruments, playing a beautiful, upbeat symphony, completely unaware that they were currently providing the elegant soundtrack for an impending absolute massacre. The party was in full swing, the laughter was incredibly loud, and the sun was shining brightly on their fake perfect world. The heavy steel jaws of the trap were completely open, and my entire family was standing directly in the center, happily admiring the bait. Marcus was standing right in the center of the massive circular driveway, preparing to deliver a highly boastful toast. He raised his expensive crystal glass high into the air, tapping the side with a silver spoon to command the absolute attention of his 100 wealthy church guests. A wide, arrogant smile stretched across his face as he took a deep breath, ready to preach about his incredible financial success. But before a single word could leave his mouth, the heavy wrought iron gates at the entrance of the estate suddenly swung open. The loud chatter of the party guests began to aggressively die down. The sudden interruption was not a late-arriving luxury car or a lost catering delivery van. It was a white and green county sheriff cruiser, its light bar flashing silently in the bright afternoon sun. Following closely behind the police vehicle was a dark silver corporate sedan with heavily tinted windows. The two vehicles pulled slowly up the long, winding driveway, cutting a direct path right through the middle of the extravagant outdoor party. The live string quartet players lowered their wooden bows one by one, creating an incredibly awkward and heavy silence across the manicured lawn. The only sound left was the gentle splashing of the stone water fountain. Marcus slowly lowered his crystal glass, his thick brows furrowing in absolute confusion. The arrogant smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a deep underlying flicker of panic. Valerie quickly pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her diamond pendant sparkling aggressively as she demanded to know who had invited the police to her exclusive private event. The vehicles shifted into park and the heavy doors opened. Two uniformed county sheriff deputies stepped out of the cruiser, their hands resting casually on their heavy utility belts. From the silver corporate sedan emerged a tall, severe-looking white woman wearing a sharp navy blue business suit. She was clutching a thick manila folder tightly against her chest. She had the unmistakable cold demeanor of a senior banking executive, a woman who destroyed dreams for a living. The three officials walked directly up to Marcus, completely ignoring the 100 wealthy church elders and community leaders staring open-mouthed at them. "Are you Marcus Davis?" the severe woman asked, her voice carrying sharply across the silent driveway. Marcus puffed his chest out, trying desperately to maintain his authoritative patriarch persona in front of his prestigious audience. "Yes, I am the owner of this beautiful estate," he stated, trying to sound incredibly confident. "Is there some sort of problem, officers?" The bank executive opened the thick manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy red bonded paper. "You are not the owner of anything, Mr. Davis," she stated coldly, extending her hand and forcing the document directly into his chest. "I am the senior underwriting director for the primary lending institution. As of 3 o'clock this afternoon, your residential mortgage application has been absolutely and permanently denied." Valerie gasped loudly, digging her sharp acrylic nails into Marcus's arm. "That is completely impossible!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the silent crowd. "We have a guaranteed pre-approval from the bank. We already paid our massive escrow deposit. You people are making a terrible mistake and ruining my party." The bank executive adjusted her glasses, looking at Valerie with pure professional disgust. Your massive escrow deposit check suffered a catastrophic hard bounce 3 days ago due to an invalid routing number, she explained loudly, ensuring every single guest heard her clearly. Furthermore, your primary financial guarantor formally withdrew her signature and completely severed her liability from this transaction earlier this week. Without her pristine credit score, our automated algorithm ran a fresh hard pull on your individual credit file. Marcus's face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He looked down at the red denial letter in his trembling hands, his entire fake reality completely shattering into a million pieces. The church elders were standing incredibly close, leaning in to hear every single humiliating word. The executive continued relentlessly, completely stripping him of his fake dignity. Your personal debt-to-income ratio is currently sitting at 86%, she announced, her voice ringing like a loud funeral bell. You have 5 severely delinquent credit cards, a hidden auto loan, and absolutely zero liquid assets. You do not qualify to finance a garden shed, let alone a $1.5 million luxury estate. Brad frantically pushed his way through the crowd of stunned guests, his face flushed bright red. He stepped in front of Marcus, holding up his hands like he was trying to stop a speeding train. "Excuse me," he interrupted, his voice shaking with desperate arrogance. "I am the licensed broker of record for this transaction. You cannot just deny the loan on the closing date. We have a legally binding early occupancy agreement, and I demand to speak to your superior immediately." The bank executive slowly turned her head and looked Brad up and down with absolute contempt. "Ah, yes, Mr. Brad Miller," she said, pulling a second piece of paper from her folder. "I was instructed to hand this to you if you were present. Your state broker license was temporarily suspended by the Ethics Commission this morning, pending an active federal investigation into severe mortgage fraud. You have absolutely no legal authority here, and frankly, you are incredibly lucky you are not currently in handcuffs." Brad physically stumbled backward, his jaw dropping open in pure shock. Chloe let out a loud, terrified wail, burying her face in her hands. The invincible white knight of the family had just been completely slaughtered in front of the entire congregation. Before Marcus could even open his mouth to form a pathetic excuse, the lead sheriff deputy stepped forward, ending the conversation permanently. "Mr. Davis," the deputy said, his voice deep and completely uncompromising. "Since the financial transaction is officially dead, your early occupancy agreement is completely void. You and your entire family are currently trespassing on private property. The legal sellers of this estate have instructed us to remove you immediately. You have exactly 2 hours to pack whatever personal belongings you brought inside and vacate these premises, or you will be arrested and physically dragged off this lawn." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. And then suddenly the whispers began. Over 100 wealthy church guests immediately started murmuring to one another, pointing at Marcus and shaking their heads in absolute disgust. People began pulling out their cell phones, actively recording the humiliating spectacle. The great Marcus Davis, the incredibly holy and successful patriarch, was completely exposed as a massive financial fraud. Sitting in the cool, dark interior of my SUV, I watched the entire beautiful disaster unfold perfectly. The housewarming party was completely dead. The R&B music was gone, replaced by the loud, humiliating sound of public ruin. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee, watching my father completely collapse under the heavy weight of the absolute truth. Valerie let out a sound that I could only describe as a wounded animal caught in a brutal steel trap. The bright yellow designer silk dress she was wearing suddenly looked less like a symbol of extreme wealth and more like a tragic theatrical costume. She lunged forward, her sharp acrylic nails aggressively swiping through the air as she tried to snatch the red denial letter right out of my father's trembling hands. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria, insisting that the senior bank executive was completely lying. She shouted that her bank accounts were full, that her credit was flawless, and that this was nothing more than a pathetic clerical error designed to deliberately sabotage her spectacular day. The bank executive did not even flinch. She simply took a calculated step backward, allowing the large county sheriff deputy to smoothly step in between them. The deputy placed a firm, heavy hand on his leather utility belt and issued a loud, stern warning for Valerie to step back immediately or face formal obstruction charges. Valerie froze, her chest heaving violently, but the devastating reality of the situation was actively refusing to penetrate her thick wall of absolute delusion. She spun around to face her stunned church guests, waving her arms frantically and demanding that the live string quartet resume playing their classical music. But the musicians were already frantically packing their expensive wooden instruments into velvet cases, desperate to escape the escalating legal nightmare. The church congregation, usually so remarkably composed and deeply pious, rapidly devolved into a ruthless and unforgiving audience. The polite murmurs of confusion instantly erupted into loud, scandalized gasps and harsh, judgmental whispers. I watched from the absolute safety of my tinted window as Deacon Hayes, the exact wealthy man Brad had just been aggressively hustling for startup investment money, pulled out his smartphone. He pointed the high-definition camera directly at Marcus's sweating face, completely zooming in on my father's absolute public humiliation. Dozens of other guests immediately followed his lead. The glittering social event of the season, the absolute pinnacle of Marcus's fabricated empire, had instantly transformed into a viral train wreck, playing out in real time across dozens of digital screens. The sheer magnitude of the public humiliation was staggering. These were the specific people Marcus had spent decades carefully cultivating to view him as a flawless spiritual guide and a brilliant financial leader. He had preached to them about honesty, integrity, and divine financial blessings. Now they were actively recording his total financial destitution and his impending physical eviction from a property he had fraudulently claimed to own. Marcus's dark eyes darted wildly around the manicured lawn, finally landing on the harsh, undeniable reality of his catastrophic situation. He shoved the crumpled red denial letter deep into the pocket of his tailored suit and desperately pulled his expensive cell phone from his jacket. I watched his thick thumb aggressively stab at the glass screen, dialing my personal number. He was officially out of options, out of money, and completely out of time. Inside the quiet, dark sanctuary of my luxury SUV, my phone remained completely and entirely silent. I had preemptively blocked his phone number, Valerie's phone number, and Chloe's phone number the exact moment I drove away from their suffocating rented house on Sunday night. Marcus held the phone tightly against his ear, his face contorting in sheer naked panic as the automated carrier message coldly informed him that the number he was desperately trying to reach was permanently unavailable. He pulled the phone away, staring at the glowing screen, as if the device had physically burned his hand. He tried dialing again, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the phone onto the expensive Italian marble of the driveway. Still absolutely nothing. The total realization that his obedient golden goose had permanently flown the coop and cut all communication finally washed over his aging features. The carefully constructed facade of the happy, wealthy family completely shattered right there on the grass. With the police standing firm demanding they vacate the premises and the church guests recording every single agonizing second they violently turned on each other like starving animals locked in a tiny cage. Valerie spun around and slapped Brad hard across the shoulder, her massive diamond pendant swinging wildly across her chest. She screamed directly into his face, blaming his incompetent amateur real estate skills for completely ruining her perfect society debut. Brad, his face still starkly pale from the devastating news of his suspended state broker license, screamed right back at her. He completely abandoned his smooth corporate persona and his fake polite manners. He shouted that her massive secret credit card debt, her reckless gambling, and her completely toxic financial history were the real reasons the underwriters had permanently killed the loan. Brad pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at Marcus, calling him a weak, broke old man who could not even successfully control his own bank account, let alone his own rebellious daughter. The arrogant white knight of the family had completely lost his armor, and he was actively tearing down the very people he had tried to exploit. Chloe was sobbing hysterically, sinking down onto the perfectly manicured grass, in her expensive white designer outfit, completely ruining the pristine fabric. She kept wailing loudly about her destroyed wedding plans and her terrible public embarrassment, completely oblivious to the fact that her mother was standing mere inches away from being physically handcuffed for disorderly conduct. The extravagant catering staff, realizing the absolute severity of the financial collapse, immediately stopped serving the expensive imported champagne and gourmet appetizers. I watched the head caterer angrily march straight up to Marcus, loudly demanding an immediate cash payment for the food and the extensive staffing hours, clearly recognizing that the credit card on file was about to be officially and permanently declined by the payment processors. The chaos was a perfectly orchestrated symphony of absolute financial destruction. Marcus was completely and entirely surrounded. He was trapped between the furious unpaid caterer, the unyielding sheriff deputies, his hysterical screaming fiancée, and 100 recording smartphones actively broadcasting his ruin to the entire community. He looked incredibly small and frail, his tailored charcoal suit suddenly appearing overly large on his rapidly deflating frame. He reached up with a trembling hand and wiped a thick, heavy bead of sweat from his forehead, looking desperately down the long, tree-lined street. He was actively searching for my car. He was scanning the long line of parked luxury vehicles, hoping beyond hope that I would suddenly appear out of nowhere to fix his massive, catastrophic mess. He desperately wanted me to step out of the shadows, wave my magic corporate checkbook, and save his fragile male ego from the crushing, unbearable weight of this public disgrace. But I remained perfectly still, hidden in the dark shadows of my tinted windows, taking another slow sip of my iced coffee. The deadline for saving Marcus Davis had officially expired, and the absolute worst part of his nightmare was still yet to come. Brad was not used to losing. He had floated through his entire life completely insulated by his wealthy parents and his towering unearned confidence. Seeing Marcus completely crumble and Valerie on the verge of being arrested did not trigger any sense of loyalty or concern in him. Instead, it triggered his desperate need to assert his dominance and save his own highly lucrative payday. He violently adjusted the collar of his pastel blue linen suit, pushed his way past the hysterical Valerie, and stepped directly into the personal space of the senior banking executive. He puffed out his chest, looking down at her, with the exact same patronizing glare he had used on me over the phone. "Listen to me very carefully," Lady Brad sneered aggressively, pointing a manicured finger at the woman. "I do not care what some glitchy automated underwriting algorithm says. You are currently standing on private property, interfering with a legally binding real estate transaction that I personally brokered. I have the signed earnest money disclosures, the seller-approved occupancy addendums, and a rock-solid escrow agreement. You are actively violating my client's civil rights and breaching standard fiduciary protocols. If you do not get your people off this lawn right now, I am going to personally sue your financial institution for tortious interference, breach of contract, and massive punitive damages." He crossed his arms, entirely convinced that throwing around a few heavy legal buzzwords would instantly intimidate a woman who was simply doing her job. He relied completely on his loud voice, his aggressive posture, and his expensive suit to bully people into complete submission. "My corporate lawyers will have your job by Monday morning," Brad added, flashing a cold, arrogant smirk. The senior underwriting director did not blink. She did not take a step back, and she certainly did not look intimidated by the loud, mediocre man towering over her. She simply offered him a cold, razor-sharp smile that sent a visible shiver down my spine, even from inside the safety of my car. She slowly opened her thick manila folder for the third time. "That is a fascinating legal threat, Mr. Miller," the executive replied, her voice dripping with absolute icy precision. "However, it is incredibly difficult to file a corporate lawsuit when you are actively under federal investigation for predatory lending practices." She pulled out a thick, heavy packet of paper stamped with the official gold seal of the State Real Estate Licensing Commission and shoved it firmly against his chest. Brad instinctively grabbed the heavy packet, his arrogant sneer completely freezing on his face as he read the bold black letters printed across the top page. Emergency license suspension and notice of criminal referral. Brad's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, but absolutely no sound came out. The bank executive stepped closer to him, actively raising her voice, so the entire crowd of stunned church guests could hear the magnificent details of his absolute downfall. The State Ethics Commission received a highly detailed emergency complaint early Wednesday morning, she announced loudly. The official file contained crystal-clear audio evidence of you explicitly detailing a fraudulent cross-collateralization scheme. You openly admitted on tape to falsifying commercial loan documents, committing blatant notary fraud, and attempting to illegally encumber your own client's primary residence to secretly fund your private startup company. Furthermore, you actively attempted to bribe a senior banking official to facilitate this massive federal crime. The color completely drained from Brad's face, leaving him looking like a sick, pale ghost standing in the bright afternoon sun. His hands shook so violently the thick legal packet slipped from his fingers, and the heavy pages scattered wildly across the manicured green grass. The invincible white knight, the brilliant financial visionary who thought he could effortlessly manipulate an entire black family for his own corporate gain, was officially dead. Brad had always relied on his inherent privilege to effortlessly glide through life. When he made a mistake, his wealthy parents would simply write a check to make it disappear. When he failed a real estate exam, he just paid for an expensive tutor and took it again. He genuinely believed that the rules governing the rest of the world simply did not apply to him. But out here in the unforgiving realm of federal banking regulations and documented mortgage fraud, his privilege was absolutely worthless. The algorithmic truth and the recorded audio files did not care about his confident smile or his expensive pastel suit. He was not just losing his massive commission check, he was going to lose his absolute freedom. The bank executive casually informed him that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already been notified of the massive wire fraud implications and that he should secure criminal defense counsel immediately. The church elders standing nearby gasped loudly, actively stepping away from Brad as if his newly minted criminal status was a highly contagious disease. The smartphones recording the event aggressively zoomed in on his terrified, sweating face. He looked desperately around the lawn, searching for any possible escape route, but the two large sheriff deputies had already moved closer, resting their hands meaningfully on their heavy steel handcuffs. Brad was completely trapped by his own towering hubris. The absolute finality of the situation finally pierced through Chloe's thick wall of entitled denial. She stared at the scattered papers on the grass, reading the terrifying words criminal referral with wide, panicked eyes. Her perfectly planned future of exclusive country club memberships, luxury island vacations, and the brand new luxury SUV Brad had promised her for a wedding gift was completely evaporating right in front of her eyes. She was not going to be the wealthy wife of a brilliant real estate chief executive. She was going to be the publicly humiliated ex-fiancé of a convicted felon. Chloe let out a loud, piercing wail that sounded like a broken siren echoing across the massive estate. She dropped to her knees on the hard stone driveway, completely ignoring the dirt and debris permanently staining her expensive white designer outfit. "You told me we were going to be rich!" Chloe screamed, sobbing hysterically and pointing a shaking finger at her paralyzed fiancé. "You promised me a massive diamond ring and a luxury startup company. You are nothing but a broke, pathetic criminal. I cannot marry a man going to federal prison. How could you completely ruin my life like this?" Brad did not even look at her. He was staring blankly at the stone water fountain, his mind completely short-circuiting as his privileged reality collapsed inward. He had specifically told me over the phone to keep my mouth shut and leave my name exactly where it belonged. He had arrogantly demanded that I let the adults handle the heavy lifting. I had simply followed his instructions to the absolute letter. I had handed his entire fraudulent confession directly to the authorities and let them lift him right out of his entire professional career. Sitting comfortably in the driver's seat of my quiet SUV, I watched the spectacular implosion of the golden couple. They had spent years mocking me, belittling my hard work, and treating my banking career as a convenient cash machine for their lavish desires. Now the spoiled stepsister was screaming on the ground, and the arrogant broker was staring down the barrel of a lengthy federal prison sentence. The extravagant housewarming party had transformed into an absolute legal slaughterhouse, and the sweet taste of poetic justice was incredibly satisfying. Marcus completely ignored his sobbing stepdaughter and her paralyzed fiancé. His massive ego absolutely refused to accept this devastating public defeat. He turned his back on Brad, dismissing the ruined broker entirely, and stepped right back into the personal space of the senior underwriting director. He squared his shoulders, trying desperately to summon the booming, authoritative voice he used every single Sunday at the church pulpit. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at the pristine brick mansion behind them and aggressively demanded that she listen to him. He loudly proclaimed that he did not need a criminal real estate broker, and he certainly did not need his ungrateful daughter's credit score to secure his dream property. He puffed out his chest and proudly announced to the entire crowd of recording church guests that he was a highly successful man who had worked tirelessly for over 30 years. He declared that he had a massive corporate retirement portfolio and that he was fully prepared to authorize a direct wire transfer to cover the entire down payment in straight cash right this very second. He demanded that the executive pull up his file and process the retirement withdrawal immediately so he could legally force the police off his property and salvage his reputation. The bank executive did not look intimidated, and she certainly did not look impressed. She looked at my father with a mixture of profound professional pity and absolute icy disdain. She calmly opened her secure corporate tablet, her fingers gliding smoothly across the digital screen. She informed Marcus that when the primary guarantor officially withdrew her signature, the underwriting department was legally required to verify every single one of his declared financial assets. She stated that they had already pulled the direct balances for his primary retirement fund and his supplementary pension accounts earlier that morning to see if he could qualify on his own merit. Marcus stood incredibly tall, crossing his arms over his chest with absolute arrogant defiance. He loudly boasted that there should be nearly $400,000 sitting safely inside that account. He told the executive to run the numbers again, calling her completely incompetent and threatening to have her fired for embarrassing him in front of his congregation. The silence on the manicured lawn was absolute. The live music was gone. The catering staff had stopped moving, and over 100 church guests were collectively holding their breath. The bank executive looked up from her tablet and locked her cold eyes directly onto my father's sweating face. She did not lower her voice. In fact, she spoke louder, ensuring the devastating truth reached the very back of the crowded driveway. She informed Mr. Davis that his primary retirement account did not contain $400,000. She stated with brutal clinical precision that his life savings currently held an available balance of exactly $42.15. Marcus physically swayed as if he had just been struck in the chest with a heavy iron bat. He shook his head violently, his voice dropping to a hoarse, desperate whisper. He insisted that was completely impossible. He claimed he had never touched that money and had been contributing a massive percentage of his paycheck to that specific fund for 3 decades. He stepped closer to the tablet, demanding to see the transaction ledger with his own 2 eyes. The executive calmly read the verified financial history aloud. She detailed a catastrophic series of massive cash withdrawals that had systematically drained the entire account over the past 3 months. She listed 6-figure wire transfers sent directly to 3 separate domestic casino resorts and 2 notorious offshore gambling syndicates. And then she delivered the absolute final lethal blow. She stated that every single one of those massive withdrawals had been legally authorized and signed by his joint account holder. The executive slowly raised her perfectly manicured finger and pointed it directly at Valerie. Valerie was standing near the stone water fountain, her face completely drained of blood. She was already taking slow, calculated steps backward toward the street, desperately trying to slip away through the crowd of stunned guests. The fragile, innocent housewife act instantly evaporated. Her bright yellow designer silk dress suddenly looked like a giant neon warning sign. Marcus turned around very slowly, The realization hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. He had destroyed his relationship with his own daughter, he had publicly humiliated himself, and he was currently facing complete homelessness, all for a woman who had secretly bled him absolutely dry. Valerie had not just ruined his daily credit score. She was a severe gambling addict who had systematically stolen his entire life savings behind his back while smiling at him across the dinner table. "Valerie, what did you do?" Marcus whispered, his voice cracking with pure, unimaginable agony. Finding herself completely cornered with nowhere left to run, Valerie entirely dropped her sweet Christian persona. Her face twisted into a vicious, ugly sneer. She screamed at him at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing violently across the estate. She called him a pathetic, boring old fool. She completely admitted to taking the money, shouting that she deserved every single penny for having to endure his endless religious sermons and his cheap lifestyle. She shockingly confessed right there on the lawn that the only reason she had violently demanded $50,000 for the wedding champagne at the bridal boutique was because she owed a massive fresh debt to a local bookie and desperately needed my money to save her own skin. The final mask was completely gone. The beautiful, perfect family Marcus had desperately tried to project to the world was instantly reduced to a violent feral pack of starving animals. Marcus let out a deafening roar of pure, blind rage and lunged directly at Valerie, his large hands reaching aggressively for her throat. The manicured lawn instantly exploded into absolute pure chaos. The two large sheriff deputies immediately sprang into action, violently tackling Marcus to the ground before he could reach her. They slammed his face into the soft green grass, pulling his arms behind his back and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Valerie was screaming obscenities, kicking her expensive heels at the police officers, and trying to flee. Brad suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state and charged at Valerie, screaming that she was a toxic gambling thief who had completely ruined his entire real estate career. Chloe was sobbing hysterically, pulling aggressively at her mother's designer dress, and begging everyone to stop fighting. The furious head caterer was actively screaming at the chaotic pile of bodies, demanding his cash payment. The wealthy church elders were actively backing away in sheer horror, their smartphones continuously recording the violent, disgraceful brawl from every single possible angle. The entire scene was a mesmerizing swirl of absolute destruction. People were shouting, crying, and physically tearing each other apart over a pile of stolen money and a luxury house none of them would ever own. Sitting safely in the cool, quiet interior of my luxury SUV, I watched the spectacular implosion reach its absolute violent peak. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the man being handcuffed on the grass. He had commanded me to stay away from his family, and I had simply given him exactly what he wanted. I had removed my protective financial shield and let them completely destroy themselves with their own toxic greed. The violent brawl on the manicured lawn finally burned itself out, leaving nothing but the exhausted, heavy breathing of completely defeated people. Additional county sheriff cruisers had arrived with their sirens wailing, responding to the emergency dispatch call the senior bank executive had placed during the physical altercation. I watched closely as a team of deputies began formally executing the immediate eviction order. They marched straight through the towering mahogany double doors and began unceremoniously tossing the expensive staging furniture and the designer luggage Valerie had prematurely moved in directly onto the hard concrete of the driveway. It was the absolute perfect moment to finally make my formal appearance. I reached for the heavy interior handle of my luxury SUV and pushed the door open. My expensive black stiletto stepped out onto the asphalt, the sharp heel clicking loudly against the street. The slow visual reveal tracked upward, tracing the sharp, tailored lines of my custom dark charcoal power suit. The structured fabric absorbed the bright afternoon sun, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable corporate authority. I adjusted the lapel of my jacket, lightly brushing my finger against the edge of the crisp white medical bandage still secured above my left eyebrow, and began walking deliberately across the street toward the estate. My quiet approach commanded immediate and absolute attention. As I stepped onto the edge of the sprawling property, the whispering crowd of wealthy church elders and prestigious community leaders instinctively parted, making a wide, clear path for me to walk through. They recognized me immediately as Marcus's estranged daughter, the supposed bitter black sheep he had constantly complained about to the congregation. But looking at me now radiating cold, unyielding power and total financial dominance, their expressions instantly shifted from quiet judgment to absolute undeniable fear. They realized in real time that I was not a broken victim. I was the ruthless architect of this entire spectacular apocalypse. I stopped at the edge of the manicured grass, standing perfectly still with my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I looked exactly like a conquering queen, silently surveying a battlefield she had meticulously designed. The expansive front lawn was completely trashed, littered with shattered crystal champagne flutes, trampled gourmet appetizers, and the scattered legal pages of Brad's suspended real estate broker license. A deputy aggressively tossed a heavy Louis Vuitton suitcase out the front door, and it landed with a loud, pathetic thud near the stone water fountain, bursting open and spilling Valerie's expensive, brightly colored silk dresses directly into the wet, muddy dirt. Marcus was sitting heavily on the concrete curb, his hands securely handcuffed behind his back. His custom-tailored suit was completely ruined by deep green grass stains and the violent physical struggle. He slowly lifted his heavy head, and his dark, bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. There was no booming authoritative voice left inside him. There was no arrogant patriarch demanding my immediate submission. He just stared at me, his chest heaving, his expression a hollow, miserable mixture of profound shock and complete devastation. Valerie had been furiously attempting to scrape her ruined designer silk dresses out of the muddy puddles near the stone fountain when she finally noticed the heavy silence that had fallen over the crowd. She whipped her head around, and her wild eyes locked directly onto me. The utter realization of what had actually happened hit her with blinding clarity. She suddenly understood that the withdrawn financial guarantee, the massively bounced escrow check, and the total annihilation of her high society dream were not random administrative errors. They were a perfectly orchestrated execution, and I was the executioner. A completely guttural scream ripped from her throat. She dropped her muddy clothes and charged directly across the lawn toward me. She looked absolutely unhinged, her expensive yellow dress torn at the hem, her hair wildly out of place, and her heavy diamond pendant swinging violently against her chest. She raised her sharp acrylic nails, screaming that I was a bitter, jealous monster and threatening to physically tear my face off. I did not flinch. I did not even take a single step backward. I simply stood my ground and let the system work exactly as it was designed to do. Before Valerie could get within 5 feet of me, the two massive county sheriff deputies intercepted her path. They moved with swift, brutal efficiency. One deputy grabbed her flailing arm, twisting it sharply behind her back, while the other drove her forward. Valerie hit the damp, manicured grass face first with a loud, sickening thud. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly around her wrists echoed clearly over the stunned whispers of the church congregation. She thrashed wildly against the soft dirt, screaming obscenities and demanding that her wealthy friends step in and help her. But absolutely no one moved. The prestigious church elders simply watched in horrified silence as the elegant society woman was reduced to a violently thrashing criminal. I slowly reached my hand into my tailored black leather handbag. My fingers brushed past my corporate laptop and pulled out the crisp white medical document I had kept safely folded since Tuesday night. I stepped forward, looking down at Valerie, whose face was currently pressed firmly into the muddy grass. I offered her a small, chilling smile. I turned my attention to the lead sheriff deputy and handed him the certified medical paperwork. I calmly informed him that he was currently restraining a woman who had a fully processed active felony warrant. I explained that she had committed a severe second-degree physical assault against me just a few days prior, causing blunt force trauma that required 7 medical stitches. The deputy scanned the official hospital letterhead, noted the signature of the emergency room doctor, and immediately radioed dispatch to confirm the active felony warrant status. Within seconds, the radio crackled back with a harsh affirmative code. The deputy hauled Valerie roughly to her feet, her yellow dress now completely coated in wet brown mud. He loudly informed her right in front of the 100 wide-eyed church guests that she was officially under arrest for felony assault. The ultimate social climber was not going to spend her evening drinking imported champagne in a luxury mansion. She was going straight to a cold concrete holding cell. As Valerie was dragged kicking and screaming toward the back of the county sheriff cruiser, Marcus completely broke down. The sheer crushing weight of his absolute ruin finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his massive fragile ego. He had no luxury mansion. He had absolutely zero retirement savings. His pristine, untouchable reputation within the church community was permanently destroyed, and his future wife was currently sitting in the back of a squad car facing violent felony charges. He struggled against his tight steel handcuffs, awkwardly shifting his body weight until he was kneeling directly on the hard concrete of the driveway. Tears began streaming rapidly down his face, carving clean, wet lines through the dirt and sweat covering his cheeks. "Kiara, please," he sobbed, his deep voice trembling with desperate, pathetic agony. "You have to stop this. You are a powerful corporate executive. You can call the bank underwriters and fix the loan. You can post the bail money and pay off these caterers. Please, my beloved daughter, I am your father. You cannot just leave me here with absolutely nothing." I stood towering over him, looking down at the man who had spent my entire childhood making me feel incredibly small and entirely worthless. He was finally offering me the exact validation and fatherly desperation I had once spent years craving, but it was exactly 30 years too late. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. My heart was completely shielded in solid, impenetrable ice. I looked him directly in his dark, bloodshot eyes, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devastatingly calm. "You sent me a text message while I was bleeding on a hospital bed, Marcus," I reminded him smoothly. "You told me not to make a big deal out of my physical injuries. You explicitly commanded me to stay completely away from your family until your perfect little house closing was done." I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the heavy silence amplify the absolute finality of my next words. "And I am someone who always follows instructions." I turned my back on him, completely ignoring his loud, desperate wailing. I walked steadily across the street to my luxury black SUV, the sharp click of my stilettos echoing with total finality. I opened the heavy door, climbed into the pristine leather interior, and started the engine. As I pulled away from the curb, the dark tinted window slowly rolled up, completely severing me from the chaotic sounds of his ultimate destruction. The visual frame slowly pulls back, leaving Marcus kneeling in the dirt, looking incredibly small and pathetic, while my vehicle disappears down the tree-lined street. The heavy scent of the hospital and the damp manicured grass fades away, completely replaced by the quiet ambient hum of my downtown Chicago penthouse. I am sitting exactly where I started, resting comfortably on my glossy leather sofa. I reach out and pick up my crystal glass of expensive aged bourbon, feeling the smooth, heavy weight in my hand. The surgical stitches on my forehead have long since healed, leaving behind a tiny faint scar that serves as a permanent, beautiful reminder of my ultimate personal liberation. They always say that blood is thicker than water, and that family is supposed to be forever. But when the blood they share is actively poisoning your soul, the only logical corporate solution is a complete and total amputation. I raise my crystal glass to the glittering city skyline, shining brightly outside my massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Here is to setting absolute boundaries. Here is to protecting your hard-earned peace. And here is to never apologizing for letting toxic people completely destroy themselves. Cheers.